Welcome back. It's Beyond the Box Score. I'm Dan Schneier, joined as always my co-host Jacob Gibbs, and today we welcome on a special guest. You guys definitely know this one. It's ESPN Seth Walder, their sports analytics writer. I'm sure you've read his betting column on Thursdays and Friday. It comes out sometimes Thursday or Friday. The Saturday analytics stats focus story, and of course, you've seen him on Twitter. This dude is at the forefront of analytics, and I'm excited to talk football with him today. Jacob, this is one of our most exciting guests I think we've had. I think we discussed this all week, how excited we were to talk ball with him. So I'm going to turn it over to you first, Jacob. What do you want to know first from Seth? What do you want to get going with him?
So much that we've got on the plate here to talk about with Seth. Super excited. I see him pop up on Twitter all the time. Particularly what got my attention recently, what sparked this connection was he was tweeting about motion at the snap. And so you guys follow me, you know that I'm kind of obsessed with motion and how that's been changing the league as offenses and defenses are kind of playing this chess game, interacting and figuring each other out. Motion at the snap has really increased. So I'm excited to talk to him about that, see which teams are doing that, which teams are doing that well. It's just so, Dan and I love getting into the coaching side of things and the scheming and then all of that. So really excited to see what Seth's been seeing. But we've got a lot to talk about. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, let's start there, Seth. Yeah, and first, obviously, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you guys too. This is really fun. I'm so motion. I'm glad you brought it up, and we're going right to the jump because this is a story I've been focused on for years, really. So in 2019, I think it was, we started our video tracking team. Just to give background here, because I think it might be helpful. A video tracking team decided they wanted to add tracking motion. This is a team at ESPN that has tracked for years, like all sorts of parts of football that we use across ESPN. And so they were adding motion. They had the foresight to separate out motion and set and versus motion at the snap. And that proved to be crucial. About halfway through that year, I was looking at that new data. I was like, okay, we got like half a season of this. Let's see what we got here. And what we were seeing was an advantage for offenses when they were using motion at the snap. It was more efficient plays. That year, it was Baltimore really doing it. So the Ravens were pushing the envelope when it came to motion at the snap, and they were having a ton of success. But even if you took out the Ravens, it wasn't just like a Lamar Jackson thing. We were seeing motion at the snap was having a success across the league. I actually had done most of the research for this story. And then I don't know if you guys remember this game, but there was a Ravens-Rams Monday night game, and the Ravens scored like 1 million points. And I was sitting there watching the press conference, and Sean McVay said they just did an amazing job of using motion at the snap to mess up our run fits and cause confusion in our defense. And I emailed my editor right away. I was like, we got to run this story this week. And I just stayed up till 3 a.m. and wrote it that night because I was like, we gotta just get this thing out. And it's been really cool to see this shift. I mean, we're talking about 4% of the time in 2017, teams use motion at the snap, and we're up to 26% of the time this year, just on average. So this has been just a wild change across the league.
And something that Jacob touched on a bunch this offseason, Seth, and I want to get your take on, was doing the research behind it, and it showed, pre-snap motion, passing EPA is up when teams use pre-snap motion. Fantasy points per dropback, that's what we focus on. The fantasy side of it is up. And something that we wanted to touch on first is motion at the snap and the difference between that and what you've seen from that.
Sorry, you're talking about just say that again. So you're saying
so for example, which play, let's get into maybe the more specifics of it. Let me be a little bit more specific. What players are we seeing being used most as route runners with motion at the snap?
That's the one piece he said he didn't have. I was like, this is what fantasy players can be the most curious about. He's like, I actually don't have that data. What I want to know is I've seen you, Seth, say that motion at the snap is more important than pre-snap motion. And I think intuitively that makes sense. Anytime, if it looks like a cheat code, anytime you see Tutu Atwell being used that way, or the Dolphins, obviously, the beginning of last year, it seems to work. And just thinking about these players being able to get up to 60, 70, 80% of the speed, which you might actually have the actual numbers since you have all the tracking data for how fast they're going, what percentage of their top speed they're going. To see them do that while the defender is still kind of flat-footed, just waiting, just seems unfair. And so I guess I was curious if you had any specific information on quantifying how much of a boost it is, or if you had any basis for why you say it is more important than the pre-snap motion.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's funny because what you're describing, the sort of like speed edge, I think is the more recent development of motion at the snap. Like when I wrote about it in 2019, the advantage was that you were sowing confusion, and then especially on run plays. And then run plays, the advantage was larger on run plays. Like, that's not what we're seeing now. But then we're seeing, and you were causing this sort of sowing confusion potentially in the passing game, but then also getting into a situation where the defenders know where their run fits are, but now the man is coming across, right? And he's sort of right in between two spots as the ball is snapped. And so you're making the defenders make this snap judgment. Like, am I supposed to be this gap or this gap? And if they're not on the same page, then all of a sudden you can have that advantage. Now, yes, I think you have this speed advantage, and I don't have like breakdowns on one thing we don't have is like specific motion type. So I don't have breakdowns on that, but I do think that it's so clear that you gain this edge for having both just a running start and the change of direction. When it comes to, like you're talking about, your defender is flat-footed. We have those plays, right, where the guy comes across in motion and then snaps back all before the ball is snapped, but it gives you that edge. And so all of those ways I think are advantageous for the passing offense.
So you have the rates at which each team is using it, but you don't necessarily have the ability to like filter and look at individual plays within that, where it's like, this is a snap at motion play, and I can see how efficient each of these plays have been. Okay,
no, that would be cool.
I'm going to keep pushing you for that.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep pushing you for that. I'm going to keep pushing you for the individual player data because we need it. I want to research that stuff.
I
like that from a fantasy standpoint, what you're talking about. That sounds fun.
Yeah, and I've always wondered if you see, and maybe this is maybe harder to answer, but I've always felt like pre-snap motion is a good way for the quarterbacks, especially younger quarterbacks, for the offenses to define if it's going to be man or zone coverage. I wonder if you've seen anything, like any kind of consistent data that shows like the teams with the rookie quarterbacks, the teams with the younger quarterbacks are using motion at a higher rate or anything of that nature. Or is it kind of more play caller specific?
That's a really good question that I don't have the answer to off the top of my head. I mean,
Sure.
I think my sense has always been, and probably an X's and O's expert can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. My sense is that like over time, defenses have added more disguises, and it's not always the tell that like we sometimes say it is.
Right.
Probably helps, but that's my sense. And now I'm like, as I say this, I'm curious. We have a man zone disguise like thing, and now I'm curious if those rates have increased over time. But anyway, that's just a thought that I've wondered if I guess what I'm saying is we haven't, at least when I've looked in the past, we haven't seen that offensive advantage league wide for just motion.
Okay.
And so that's why it was so crucial that when we started tracking it, or when ESPN's video tracker started tracking it, that they separated it out.
I love Dan asked that question to me, and Seth both just immediately started typing because we had ideas. Like, oh, let me go. Was the question specific to young quarterbacks? Because what I thought of was Chicago immediately. They have scaled back their motion as the year has gone on, and I think they're looking to simplify things a little bit there because it's been messy. What was the question exactly, Dan?
I was thinking the opposite. Like, you can use, for me, the core of pre-snap motion has always been to kind of help the quarterback define if it's man or zone.
Right. Yeah.
And I was curious if we saw maybe more examples of the younger teams, the younger quarterbacks using more motion for that reason to help define things for these quarterbacks.
Yeah, I think it is often just specific to the quarterback and their own preferences and tendencies. Like, I know Kyler Murray really likes things to be set and doesn't want to have to be doing a lot of that pre-snap diagnosis.
So I just looked. So I was curious because the short answer is no. Like, we have since 2017, 2024, like starting quarterback is a rookie, negative 0.03 offensive. Let's just look at dropbacks here. Negative offensive EPA is negative 0.033 with motion set at snap, and negative 0.02. No, they're slightly worse with motion and like set at snap compared to just any other play.
Okay, so before we jump into something else that I want to discuss here, I wanted to get your thoughts on which teams are using more motion at the snap.
So Miami is a team like I talked in 2019. Baltimore was a team to push the envelope. For the past few years, it's been Miami, and they are way out in front here. Like 65% of the time, they put a man in motion at the snap. No one else is over 50%. 65% is right around where they were last year. But like this is, again, 2017 on average. I think the high team in 2017 off the top of my head might have been like 9%.
So crazy.
So now we're at 65%. I mean, we're talking 7 years ago. So what a crazy bit it's evolved. So we look at Miami, Green Bay, Atlanta, Vegas, which has surprised me a little bit because we didn't see that from the Bears last year under Getsy, not to the same degree, and Tampa Bay at 33% is the fifth most likely team. I want to say one thing about this, if I can. Teams, when you look at the list of motion at the snap, you will notice for sure that the teams with better records are at the top and the teams with worse records are at the bottom. And I think part of that is, yes, I think it's an effective tool. I think it's also something that signals some progressive thought offensively. But there is a chicken and egg factor here that I think is really important to consider, which is that teams that are leading are more likely to use motion on the snap for two reasons. One, they're not worried about the clock and it can take more time when you're running these plays. And two, you're more likely to do it on a run play and you're obviously more likely to be running. So sometimes the reason, like New England is dead last at 8%. I think that is because mostly they don't want to use a lot of motion on the snap, but partly it's also because they're always losing and it's just not setting themselves into situations where they can use it.
It's a great point. I mean, if we break this down to what Jacob's found with his research, that teams that use motion is a good thing for fantasy football, and that teams that you're buying players on offenses that are scoring and good offenses, it kind of makes all sense that way. But I will say this: where's Dallas at, Nick? Because I've always watched the McCarthy system. Giants had Ben McAdoo, and it just seemed like not a lot of motion was in that system. Are they still low, Dallas?
They are. Dallas is interesting. They're at 30th, 11% of the time, 30th, so third lowest rate. Last year, if you look weeks 1 to 5, they were last or one of the very last teams in this category. Starting from week 6 on, they jumped way up. They more than doubled their early season rate and were average in motion at the snap. So they seem to have jumped back to what they did at the very beginning of last season, which I thought was sort of interesting.
Baby steps. All right, Seth, we want to get into another thing with you. There's something that I always found interesting anytime you tweeted it out. I just love the trenches play in the NFL. I'm a big lunch pail guy. I believe the game is won in the trenches plus quarterback. So I want to talk about win rates. And that's another advanced stat that you guys do, advanced metric, I should say. So how are kind of break down for us, how are these calculated as a unit? Because I saw today, I think it was today, you tweeted out New York Giants top 9, I think, in pass rush win rate. And then how does blitzing impact the pass rush win rates?
Great question. So we have these metrics: pass block win rate, pass rush win rate. The idea is, let's talk about it from the offensive perspective, but it's just the inverse of one another. The idea is, let's talk about for an individual player. The question is, if you're a tackle, say, how often do you sustain your block for 2.5 seconds? Or if you're a pass rusher, how often are you beating your blocker within 2.5 seconds? So it's pretty simple. It's using player tracking data. That's the chips in the shoulder pads. And the model is somewhat simple. It's kind of like just geometry. I have a video I tweeted in the last week, I think, where I sort of demonstrated what the model is seeing. And it really is pretty simple. It's kind of easy. I didn't create it. My coworker, Brian Burke, created it, but it's kind of easy to determine who is blocking whom, right? If you and I are facing each other, we're on opposite teams. The quarterback is behind you. We're in close proximity. You are blocking me. The model can feel very confident about that. And if I can get past you within 2.5 seconds, then I have won in this instance. So that's how we calculate pass rush win rate for individual players. You asked about teams. The way we think about teams is as a weak link system for the offense. So if one player loses their block in pass block win rate, then the team has lost that rep, right? And so the inverse is true on the pass rush. If one player wins, then the team wins if no one wins, then the team loses. Okay, the last question you said was blitzing. Yeah, blitzing matters. So like pass block win rate, pass rush win rate is kind of like the raw. It is, 1-0 down these plays. There are absolutely a ton of factors that matter. If you blitz, you are more likely to get a pass rush win, like as a team. If you are an offense and you run play action, you're more likely to get pass block wins. If you roll out the quarterback, you're more likely to get pass block wins. There's a whole bunch of other factors that can, increase or decrease the chances of your like protection success, just like every other facet of the game. At the risk of like just continuing to ramble, can I talk about the 2.5 seconds for a minute?
Yeah,
Because
I am curious.
Yes, that's sort of the crucial element here. So when Brian Burke created this metric way back in 2017 when he was building it, and the very first iteration, it was just what I described before. Did I beat you or not? No time. And what he found, like when he did his very first thing, was that he looked at Joe Thomas, and Joe Thomas had like one of the worst pass block win rates when he looked at it, and it was like, that is a alarm bell going off. And so what he realized though was that Thomas was blocking for Deshaun Kaiser, who held the ball for an eternity, and everyone eventually gets beat. And so that's when I think, maybe it's obvious now, but the light bulb went off then that we have to put these guys on the same plane. And that 2.5 seconds, which is like roughly average time to pass, that's a little under, was implemented. And when you did that, Thomas was like third in pass block win rate that year. That is such a crucial thing. We talk about quarterbacks controlling their sack rate. Quarterbacks have a lot of control over their pressure rate. The time to throw, keeping everybody in the same plane is so important for measuring offensive line play or defensive line play. And so that, I think, is really just such a crucial element here.
There are two things I wanted to get into. I'm sorry, Jacob, but there's just two things I needed to hear about on this specific topic. The first, just because the way the NFL is played today and called. The first is how are stunts and games up front like that impacted who gets considered, like for the individual pass block rates. We can get into that, and then I have one more question after that.
Yeah, so stunts, like we don't have any stunt identification system here. Like ultimately who gets credit. I mean, ultimately it's trying to make a judgment on who is blocking whom. And yeah, I mean, yes, there are times when that's tricky. Absolutely.
Okay. And then the other is a lot of defense coordinators are using simulated pressures where you'll just see like a guard with no one to be accounting for. They've wasted that guard on that play, for example. So how does that factor into this, the team pass rush play? Yeah.
So I think you're thinking of a situation where you have like a guard not blocking anybody. Now you have a free rusher coming. Yeah. So on the individual win rate, we don't give credit to the pass rusher for getting that win, but for the team, we give credit. So the idea being, if the team has failed to successfully like block up everybody, then that's a pass block loss. But obviously, the individual rusher, he just gets a free shot.
And you have simulated pressure data, but it's not quite done or something. Is that what you said before?
It's not like we have some. Like some of our metrics are like intermediate and they're easy to access, and then some are like more developmental and require me bothering people. And last year we do have simulated pressure, but I couldn't. Go ahead.
I'm just curious what the scope of it is. Like, what do you guys track?
Yeah, so I think the way that Brian does it is we have a couple different categories. Like if you have simulated pressure, or you have guys who are, a few different ways. I mean, ultimately what we found is that causing confusion in who is coming like does result in defensive advantage. And like, again, the Ravens last year under Mike McDonald, that was a team that we saw that have a lot of success doing that. And yeah, when you split out the numbers in terms of just defensive success on these plays, it was evident that it was working, I guess is what I would say, like league wide. And so that was one of the reasons why I felt like, it's really hard to obviously judge coaches, but it was just one of the reasons why I felt so bullish about McDonald going to Seattle. Yeah. It's just like, if you can give yourself a schematic advantage of it like that, that just to me is the kind of thing you would want to be looking for from a coach.
And it's really interesting because it's like, we don't have to get too far into this, but the advantage I think he does give them from a schematic standpoint. I've been studying the Seahawks tape a bunch for the Giants game this week. In the passing game is almost working against him in the run game. Like they got crushed by just the most simple duo concepts up front by Detroit because he's allocating so many resources to stopping the pass. So, and with the league changing the way it is today, it's just something interesting to see if coaches do alter their game plans with the idea in mind that, look, teams are going to start running the football more against these types of looks. But that's something that's probably for a larger discussion. Let's take a quick break to hear a word from our sponsor. When we get back, we have a couple more questions for Seth.
Well, you need your sports news anywhere.
We've got breaking news to bring you.
Then get your sports anytime you want them. Big trade news overnight to discuss.
Because we know you need sports all the time.
A lot of movement in the rankings this week.
A legend adds to their legacy.
We're bringing you that breaking news right here on HQ.
CBS Sports HQ, anywhere, anytime, all the time.
All right, Seth, another thing I really wanted to get your take on, Jacob and I wanted to get your take on, is OpenScore. Okay. What exactly is OpenScore? And get into maybe, Jacob, I'll let you kind of then take the mantle on players you want to know from an OpenScore standpoint or talk about.
Yeah, so Seth shared a video with me. It's about 5 minutes long on describing what OpenScore is and giving examples. And it's really cool, like what all goes into it in terms of leverage and stuff like that. It's not just separation. But it's also like the speed at which the players are moving relative to the defensive back, and all sorts of stuff goes into measuring it. So how he described it, and I thought this was really cool, OpenScore is actually measuring a player's ability to get open relative to expectations set by a variety of factors about the play, such as what route the receiver is running, what coverage they're facing, how deep the route is, whether there's play action, and who the quarterback is. Before we get into players, I definitely have a list that I'm curious to hear any takes from either of you on. I was just wondering if there's anything that you wanted to expand on there, Seth. Like what jumped out to me is like who the quarterback is. Is that the quality of the targets, the accuracy of the targets, or what? How does that come into play, or like how does any of this come into play in a way that's interesting to you?
Yeah, great question. So when we measure OpenScore, we're looking at multiple points on the route, and so because we're measuring whether or not they're targeted, but if they are targeted, that gives us more information. So we're looking at the time of the ball throw, but then also if the player is targeted, the time of the ball arrival. And there is obviously movement between those two events. And I think what we found was that the quarterback plays a role in that, in the sense that, it's a thing that people talk about, right? Throwing a guy open, and right. And so that plays a role. And so what we needed to do was to try to control for that. It's not fair to a receiver if you have, an elite, accuracy. If you have Aaron Rodgers throwing to you versus, whatever, a rookie or a backup quarterback. And so because ultimately we're trying to hone in on the receiver's skill itself. I'm sure that quarterback, bleeds through in ways that are not fully accounted for, but that is a thing. Even in like we have these other metrics, catch score and yak score, and I think it's really easy to imagine how quarterback matters for catch score, or why it needed to be an input. But yeah, it needed to be an input for OpenScore too.
Yeah. So the first two that you mentioned are what route the receiver's running and what coverage they're facing, and I think those two kind of go hand in hand and are really easy to see here when you look at the OpenScores. I noticed that more slot-bound players who are typically thought of as like short route runners, zone beater types, do not grade out well. Like Amon-Ra St. Brown, I think his highest OpenScore in his career is like 62. His grade this year is 50, which is the 12th lowest among 50-ish people. Greg Dortch has the worst. Deebo Samuel's 4th worst. Khalil Shakir 9th worst. Jackson Smith and Jigba 10th worst. So like I'm curious how that works with like. It's pretty easy if you're just looking at man-to-man coverage to determine like how open he is relative to the defender in terms of separation. But like, how do you quantify it with zone?
Yeah. So it's still, the idea is always, regardless of whether it's man or zone, the question is, if the quarterback makes the throw, what's the probability of a catch given the like positioning of the players around them, right? Positioning of them, their speed, where they're going, where the defenders are. zone. However, like what Brian found is that man coverage plays are more indicative of skill. And so those are weighted more heavily just by the nature of the model. It finds that your performance against man is a greater indicator of skill. The slot receiver thing is really interesting. It's sort of the inverse of what, if you just look at raw separation score, like numbers, just like the number of yards between you and the nearest defender at the time of reception. The slot guys will all be really high because they don't have because they're in the middle of the field. You don't have the boundary to be another defender, all of that. And so I don't think that it's certainly not like the intention of the model to be against those players, but it's like they are starting from a sort of baseline of like, you should be getting separation when you are in the middle of the field.
I talk with the Fantasy Points data team a lot about their separation score they just made, average separation score. And I noticed the same thing there, that deep targets are typically grading out really well. People who are working the perimeter and working down the field. And I wonder if it's just that you have the ability to create massive separation from that position. And so maybe it's just weighted more heavily. You have more like huge wins.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know how the grading system works for you guys, but does that make sense that you would be getting some 99s more often, where if you're in the middle of the field, you're just kind of piling up 60s and 50s and 70s or whatever?
I hadn't thought of it like that. I don't know like Brian Burke, who's our data scientist that created this, would be able to answer that question. It is like, that's just an interesting thought. And I just honestly don't know the answer. What you're saying, I think, makes some sense, but I don't know.
Yeah, and on the man coverage point, the fantasy people are obsessed with that. Matt Harmon, who does reception perception, if you've heard of that, is proprietary work to grade and evaluate each receiver and how they're winning against different sorts of coverages. He has found, he's done some research that shows that beating man coverage is more correlated to fantasy success over time. And it's just intuitively, I found the same thing. I've been looking at man coverage, doing that kind of research for like 5 years or so. And I just noticed it as like A.J. Brown, early career A.J. Brown, early career Justin Jefferson, early career Jamar Chase. These guys are shredding man coverage. They're good all over the place, but especially like against man coverage, they're better than we've ever seen. And then they go on to just be uncoverable, winning all over the place all the time. I think that makes sense. And it's just important note to bring up, because a lot of times, we hear all this talk about too high safeties, that there's more zone coverage than ever and all of that. Man coverage is only being used 25% of the time. Some teams only use it 5-10% of the time. So like, well, why does it matter? Why are you tweeting? Why are you so obsessed with which receivers are beating man coverage? This is why. It's skill. It shows skill. It shows an ability to win one-on-one, which ultimately is the most important thing for receivers, to be able to win one-on-one matchups. I hear Brett Coleman and Eric Schneider, one of my favorite things from them is, at the end of the day, at a certain point, everything becomes one-on-one. Everything becomes a man coverage matchup. And if you do look at like the most important parts of the field, like third downs, man coverage goes up. In the red zone, man coverage goes up. So yeah, like that's why it's so important. And I love that it's borne out in this open score as well, like that it is reflected.
Yeah, that's what you want to look for, because that's where a lot of the fantasy points are coming from. And also, just one thing to keep in mind, Jacob, when we talk about that, and something to shout out, I think the listeners would want to know, is like a lot of the time when you talk about, man coverage is at an all-time low, 25%, a lot of these things that are being charted as zone coverage are technically zone coverage, but they're zone coverage with pattern match principles. So it's like they're almost like man coverage. They're a version of man coverage. So I think it's really interesting to note, just like you said. And I'd love to see, as we get closer, some kind of more specific open score numbers on when releases off the line of scrimmage against press man, and then also at the top of the route, how receivers operate, because those are the two things that I'm most interested in from that standpoint. And I'm sure we'll get more data on that as we go. But Seth, we know you got to get out of here, so we have one more question for you here, and I'll let Jacob take that one.
So if you have anybody open score that you want to talk about, feel free to take as much time as you want, Seth. But I am, of course, curious about Nico Collins. Nico Collins is my guy, and we've seen over the last 2 years just how good he really is. He just keeps getting better, and that's reflected in his open score this year. He's third in open score with an 83 grade. But last year, in his super successful, dominant breakout season, I think his open score is 57. And so I'm really curious about that. If you have any thoughts on what goes into his score last year and potentially what has changed this year.
Okay, so I'm gonna sort of punt on the main part of your question, but use it to answer a different one. So, like, firstly, one thing I love open score, and it's it's easiest in its explainability when I'm talking about a player who has a high open score, but doesn't have a lot of production, right? Because then what I can do is go find plays where they're open and not targeted, and that makes sense. And by the way, like that doesn't always mean like the quarterback made a mistake, right? Like they might not have been the best target on the play, but like we're just measuring, hey, did you do your job like on this play? It's trickier when we're trying to say like why is somebody lower than we expect, because I go through a bunch of plays and it's like, okay, yeah, here's a play where it says like he wasn't really open and he wasn't really open. Okay, here's another one like that. But you really need this like kind of aggregate. I don't have like a reason for you as to like why Collins's open score was just like merely above average or average-ish last year, but his catch score was a 91 last season. And the reason why I want to bring this up on a fantasy show specifically is I looked at this last year. I did this story in our fantasy magazine, which I'm like looking around because I know it's somewhere like above me. But like, believe me, I did, where I looked at these receiver scores, open score, catch score, and yak score. And then I asked basically, if we take average draft position in fantasy and then we predict future success with it alone or with these three receiver scores, do we do better? Do we add accuracy when we look at these receiver scores? And the answer was yes for open score and catch score, but not yak score, which was interesting. So it's saying like, hey, yak is like fully baked in or overly baked in to ADPs, but open score and to a slightly lesser degree catch score is not. And so what I did was looking at players who were sort of outstanding in those two areas specifically, and the model suggested that they were being whatever their ADP was, the market was unlikely to be efficient on them. Nico Collins was one of those players, so I feel good about it. So is Brandon Ayuk, so less good about it. But I guess that's my point, is just that I do believe, like, this is early signs. These are pretty new metrics that I do believe that we can judge. We can use these like from a fantasy standpoint. They do offer value, perhaps like over the market. I don't know is like the real answer for Collins' 2023, but I am thrilled to see like how much the model loves him this year because he's playing out of his mind, and it seems like it's backing that up.
Yeah, and he's matching his efficiency from last year, which was insane because he really did some unprecedented things as a yak guy, and his yak is down slightly this year, but he's still matching his efficiency, which would indicate that he's probably getting open better than he was last year. This was awesome, Seth. The answer is I don't know to a lot of these, but that makes sense because this is new. And, you've got two guys here, Dan and I, that have a lot of ideas. So if you ever want to put it in a room, we'll help you guys. We'll talk about that. We can take it so many directions. It's so fun.
Yeah, thank you, Seth, so much for joining us today. And I want to make sure everybody follows Seth's work. It's as simple as it can be. You can follow him on Twitter at Seth Walder. And you can find all of his columns over at ESPN. A lot of great stuff going on over there. Seth, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks, guys.
All right, we're going to take one more quick break. And when we get back, Jacob and I are going to discuss a few things that I want to get into with him this week. The biggest waiver wire ad of the week. We're going to talk about Kliff Kingsbury and Jayden Daniels and some rush scheme stuff. And I'm going to talk about one player that I want you to add on all your rosters before this week as a deep sleeper. But before that, we're going to take a quick break to hear a word from our sponsors.
There are some things in life that you can't quite explain.
An extraordinary story.
Maybe it sounds flawless, looks effortless, or makes you feel like a part of history.
The first ever goal for BFC.
And when all of those phenomenons come together, it's perfect. Pitch perfect.
Before we depart from the analytics, is it cool if I just take like 2 or 3 minutes to quickly run down some of the stuff we just talked about?
Let's do it.
Okay, so lowest pass block win rates per ESPN analytics. This is the most interesting to me. Patriots, Chargers, Panthers, starting from the bottom.
Wow.
Panthers at 30th. That's the one that's caught everybody's attention because I've tweeted out, a lot of people have caught note of the fact that the Panthers have the lowest pressure rate in the NFL,
right,
in terms of allowing pressure. And I think so much of that has to do with the fact that they're getting the ball out really quickly. If you look at time to throw, it correlates really, really strongly with pressure rate. The Panthers have the lowest time to throw Seth said that win rate is 2.5 seconds. The only quarterback with an average time to throw below 2.5 is Andy Dalton, 2.39.
Wow.
So that is just something to keep in mind. And it's possible that maybe the Panthers offensive line isn't playing as well as we think. It's possible that, these metrics aren't perfect, as Seth would concede. I think they're still developing them. So don't overreact to it. But it is interesting. I would not have expected to see them at 30. It's also possible that it's just a 4-game sample size. Matchups have a lot of impact on this. So like if a team has had really tough, matchups in terms of the pass rushing that they're facing, that definitely affects things. But Patriots at 32, Chargers 31, Panthers at 30, Seahawks at 29, Bucks at 28. That was another one surprised me because their pressure rate is pretty low. They do get the ball out pretty quickly, especially if it's not like a Baker improv play. If you remove those when they're just clean pocket getting it out quick, it's very, very fast. Titans 27, Jets 26, Cardinals 25, Saints 24, a little bit concerning. Colts 23, Texans 22. Any thoughts on any of those, or do you want to just keep rolling?
We can roll. It's just interesting with the Baker and the Carolina stuff, just because I think maybe they were onto something last year with Dave Canales and Baker kind of carried that over. Liam Cohen, they worked together and built a system, get the ball out fast. I've always believed quarterbacks got to get the ball out fast for an offense to stay in rhythm and on time. So I think they've really done a good job exemplifying that.
For sure. I think coaches self-diagnose, and we see that reflected in the data here. So 4 of the top 5 teams in lowest time to throw are among this list of 10 teams with the worst pass block win rate. 5 of the top 7 in terms of the lowest time to throw are in this list. So they're getting the ball out quick. They're not throwing quite as deep, and they're using less play action in general, these teams that do have low pass block win rates.
Okay.
On the high end, I was a bit surprised. There were a lot of really good teams. There we go. Sorry. Buffalo Bills, Kansas City Chiefs, Baltimore Ravens, Detroit Lions, Philadelphia Eagles, Denver Broncos surprised me. 49ers, Commanders really surprised me. Bengals and Packers. So that's just an interesting note on the Commanders, as we're about to segue into a conversation about Kliff and Jayden Daniels. Maybe like the infrastructure here is just better than we expected. Maybe people are just overperforming. I don't really know what to think of that. It could also be matchup based.
Yeah.
Because they've only faced, I think, one good pass rush. Cincinnati has some good personnel, but like overall is not like an overwhelming pass rush. They've had pretty soft matchups, and they're definitely about to be tested starting this week with Cleveland. On the open score side of things, we hit on some of the low end guys. I wanted to note that Stephon Diggs has one of the highest open scores, second to only Malik Neighbors. And that is really interesting to me especially because of the note that I brought up about slot work. Generally speaking, slot receivers aren't performing well in this metric, and that's where most of Diggs's work has come. I tweeted a cut up of every Diggs target this year. I think he looks pretty good, man. I don't think he's being asked to do a whole lot, but I think that he does look pretty good, and he continue to be pretty efficient with his opportunities. I was curious if you had any thoughts on Diggs. I don't think you and I have talked about it.
We haven't talked much Diggs. I think from what I've seen, he's looked quick. He's looked explosive, specifically on that touchdown run. I like that cutback. I think what you said, though, is what stood out to me. The way they're using him is interesting. It reminds me of at times how they used him in Buffalo before his role expanded. I wonder if that's something that we'll see expand as the season goes on.
Yeah, so Diggs's open score last year was 69. It's at 84 this year. Some other players who have increased from last year to this year: Chris Olave, 75 to 82. Olave pops at the top of basically every list that I give out. George Pickens, 70 to 79. Jalen Waddle, 67 to 76. Maybe if we get things figured out in Miami, Waddle people can be saved. I know that's me and Dan. Elijah Moore, 62 to 74. Elijah Moore is another guy who pops in a lot of different metrics. He goes up in fantasy points, separation score as well. That he's another guy who's running from the slot mostly. So it was interesting to me that he was an open score. And if Amari Cooper were to be moved, maybe he does matter. I know, maybe this is just me being stubborn in my Elijah bags.
No, I mean, look, Elijah Moore is a player who I love this tape at Ole Miss. I'm one of my biggest L's. I figure I graded him out as one of the 20 best players in that class, and it just hasn't surfaced, obviously, the situation. But the one that interests me the most of everybody you said is actually George Pickens, who had a really tough slate of matchups in the first 3 weeks, but looked really good on film.
That's
then
a good
this
point,
past week, he finally got going with an easier matchup and racked up a lot of yards. His rapport continues to improve with Justin Fields. And at the same time, he's showing out really well in this score. Matt Harmon, I listened to Matt Harmon talk about him this week. He's developing into a different kind of receiver. He's developing into a complete receiver. And this is something that Rich Rebar mentioned, I think, on the show we had with him. Like, from a talent standpoint, he was just as good as any receiver in that class. Some off-field stuff had him land in round 2, but that has, and I know it's kind of popped up a little bit so far in his NFL career, Jacob, but like not to an extent where he's losing any playing time. He's still the focal point of this passing game, and they know with Justin Fields that they have no other option but to keep him on the field. So I think he's somebody who's a good buy now candidate. Obviously, you're not buying low, but you're buying the potential of him evolving into an every week wide receiver 1, which I think he can easily do.
Devontae Smith's score is way up, 49-71, which is good because last year was a bit of a step backwards in his developmental track, like his progression. Packers players, man, Dontayvion Wicks, who had a really efficient year last year, is up from 55 to 68. Jayden Reed is up from 52 to 66. I think it's clear that he's developed as a route runner, obviously great with the ball in his hands as well. Tucker Kraft, 41 to 66. He's looked really good as well, and he's earned that starting job. So I wanted to know all of them. Cole Kmet is somebody who just continues to pop. When I watched the Bears, 49 to 66, Terry McLaurin, 44 to 62. Darnell Mooney had a really bad year last year. He's up to 60 from 40 last year. And then just these three are just a perfect trio to end on. Jalen Tolbert, 30 last year to 59 this year. So he's actually, showing some competence. He has a higher score than both Jamison Williams and Quentin Johnston, which really surprised me. I wonder if there's something about Detroit's route concepts that the model doesn't really like, because they don't grade out well. But Williams, his score is up 45 to 55. Quentin Johnston up from 25, which is...
Where are the Rams receivers at?
I don't know off the top. Quentin Johnston's
I would imagine that the teams that use more tight splits, like the Rams and like the Lions, are going to probably be lower in open score rate.
I think that makes some sense. 25 for Quentin Johnston is about the lowest I've seen, except for Kyle Pitts had a 20 this year so far. But Quentin Johnston is up to 54 this year, which is above average.
Kyle Pitts. I can't even mention that name without getting angry. But I will say this. If there are two players that I want you to take away from this podcast as players that you should be scooping up on the back end of rosters, it's one player we're going to talk about at the end, and it's Jalen Tolbert. He's a player who I looked for and made sure I had on every single team where he was available to get him on after the Brandon Cooks news. Tolbert is going to be a fantasy factor here, and I love that the open score rates back that up, Jacob. But as we go ahead, did you want to say something?
The Rams are pretty low. I think that makes sense, just bringing them up. Like DeMarcus Robinson is their top guy this year, and I think he does the most isolated work. And so I think that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's something to consider when we consider these scores. But as we typically do, Jacob, we've gone a long time. We've said a lot, and we're running out of time. And there's still a lot I wanted to get to on this show. So we're going to have to go a little rapid fire with the rest of this. We're going to start with a player who was, I think, the prize of waiver wires this week. My friend Steve Hall, who is a diehard fan of you, Jacob Gibbs, and I would venture upon saying a lot of his fantasy takes are based on yours. Last year, you won him the league, essentially, in my opinion, or he finished second because of the Puka Nacua, and he blew 66% of his budget. He blew 80% of his budget on Dontayvion Wicks this week. A lot of people are blowing budgets on Wicks. Give the people what they want. Is Dontayvion Wicks a potential league winner?
He definitely is. And I'm curious if he might impact Jayden Reed more than people realize, because I think the Wicks is a better route winner than Christian Watson has shown. Matt Harmon was really, really encouraged by Wicks as well. And so I do trust his work. All the underlying data is really good. There have been some drops, but I think, the fact that he's getting open so often and drawing so many targets, it's possible that the cat's like way out of the bag at this point, and they're just not going to be able to remove him from the field if he comes out and just like torches the Rams this week, which seems pretty likely.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see what he does this week after people spend all that budget on him. My whole thing with Wicks is I think he's a great talent. I think his situation has drastically improved, but I think there are going to be some situations where the Packers are a lot less pass heavy than they were last week, where it looked
Would
like
be this week.
It could easily be this week against the Rams for a multitude of reasons, including the fact that the Rams with Sean McVay really take the air out of the ball at times and take a lot of play clock off. So we'll see what happens on that front. But I would stand by him as a talent, and the opportunity is there. I wasn't one of those people who blew the budget on him. I think the Puka situation was very different than the Wicks situation last year in free agency for a multitude of factors, also in how that offense operates. And that's a player like Jordan Whittington, who I think is interesting and should be on all rosters just because of the role within that system. I don't think Wicks has that role, but I think he has talent. And so I think he's interesting. I wanted to transition, unless you have more on Wicks, to a discussion on Jayden Daniels and Kliff Kingsbury and the Washington Commanders offense. And I will start with an apology to Kliff Kingsbury, a guy that I had buried and dragged for months and for years. It turns out that trip to Thailand, he did need it to get his mind right. And whatever he took over there, a lot of things are legal over there. So whatever he got his hands on has clearly worked and impacted what he's been able to do so far. Now, I will say this, they have faced easy defenses, but it's quite clear that he's doing things a little bit differently than he has in the past with a quarterback different than he's had in the past. And I will say this from watching the tape, Jacob. I mean, Jayden Daniels was unbelievable against Arizona. Like, a lot of that was individual stuff that he does as a quarterback that makes the coordinator look good. But there's also some interesting things from Kingsbury, some wildcat in the game on the first drive to get them some yards. So I want to know what your thoughts are moving forward with Kingsbury and Jayden, because Jayden is the QB1 overall right now in fantasy points scored. And I almost feel like now is an interesting time to sell him based on that.
It might be. I think you have a league winner, and unless there's an injury, you just hold him. Like, you're just holding on to that and riding it all the way. That's how I'm treating him. But if you want to sell, I think that could make sense because the schedule is going to be a lot harder. I don't have a whole lot to add on them. Like, when I've watched it, I've just been amazed at how simple things look and how easy things look. And I think that probably is a credit to good coaching, but could be something about the matchups too. Arizona's they're so interesting defensively. They just kind of like sit back and let it happen, and it's just like you're just getting picked apart. You're just getting picked apart. They didn't have hardly any third longs, Washington, in that game. Like, it's so easy. It looks so easy running the ball and then also passing the quick game. I will say that his Jayden Daniels' deep accuracy. We've seen a lot of big highlight throws, but overall his off-target rate on deep balls is actually one of the lowest in the league. Take that for what it's worth. I have a thread on Twitter where you can watch basically every quarterback other than like
off-target throws the worst in the league, meaning what, Jake? Hold on. Do you mean it's the best or the worst?
One of the worst.
One of the worst.
I think it's fourth worst or something like that. Okay. So in this thread, it shows every deep pass attempt from a clean pocket, and it's sorted in order of highest to lowest off-target rate. So Caleb Williams has the highest off-target rate, so he's first. And by the end, you get to Kirk Cousins, who has the lowest, which is interesting in itself. But yeah, you can watch and compare. Basically every quarterback is going to miss a throw or two here and there. Daniels, I do think he's getting better. The accuracy is getting better as the year goes on, which hopefully is a Caleb Williams note, because, man, it's been so bad with the deep ball accuracy. But I think that should be one of the strengths of his games, honestly.
It will be. And I think some of that is just timing based and rhythm based and rapport based, especially with Terry McLaurin. I feel like they've gotten better on the deep half, but also a lot of it is what you said. I think defensive coordinators are finding it difficult to scheme and game plan against Kliff and Jayden. For example,
they're not blitzing.
Exactly. You mentioned how that happened with the Cardinals. And then you go back 2 weeks before that when the Giants played them. Very few third and longs, under 25% blitz rate from Shane Bowen Giants. I was scratching my eyes out watching that game tape, Jacob, seriously, because it was just off coverage, too high. Don't put anyone near the line of scrimmage. And all they were doing was throwing around the line of scrimmage. And it's like, a week later, the Bengals tried some different things, and Jayden destroyed them over the top. So it's almost like maybe that was the right game plan. Maybe that's only the game plan you can do. And in that sense, I don't know if he's even a sell high. I just feel from the standpoint of QB1 overall, it's a little tough to see that replicating with a little bit of the tougher schedule. But look, if teams don't know how to defend this guy, we've seen this before. It takes 9 games of tape for defensive coordinators to adjust to quarterbacks in the NFL. It could be another stretch of 6, 7, 8 games where he's just torching the NFL from that standpoint.
Yeah. Brian Robinson has the second highest light boxes faced, the second highest rate, 65% of his runs. Last week, 18 of 21 runs were against light boxes, which means there's 6 or fewer defenders up in the line of scrimmage. I do think defenses aren't really sure what to do. we'll see. Cleveland is much, much more aggressive. So we'll see starting in week 5.
Cleveland is aggressive, but Cleveland has not looked great on tape this year defensively. So it's just something to keep an eye on there. I don't think this matchup is as much of a deal breaker as some are suggesting for Jayden Daniels. So it might take a little bit longer. Before we get to our next topic, though, here, and it's one we're going to close out, two we might close out with if we have time. I do want to take this time to make a little plea to the audience. If you enjoy our show and you enjoy us, please do us a favor. We need you to hit the like button. And I should ask for this earlier, and I will start doing so. But you don't know how much value it is to us as people who are starting a new show, trying to build it from scratch, to have you guys hit that like button and comment anything in the comments. It changes the algorithm for good. And one thing I've learned is if you're not subscribed yet and you enjoy this kind of content, this free content, this type of talk, analytics, film, data, this type of stuff, to get more of it, please subscribe. And then if you subscribe, more people come to the show, and that's just how it's going to build out. And there's a few other things I want to promote, Jacob, before we get back into this. I want to promote your work on the website. I want to promote the matchup notes, the newsletter that comes out every Wednesday and Thursday. And in the lab, something I'm going to let you talk about in a second, on Fridays. There's so much good content that we get and we give out for free on the site, specifically if you're signed up for the Fantasy Football Today newsletter, which Jacob writes every single day and puts in just data that's invaluable, in my opinion, to this fantasy industry. Like, obviously, you guys follow him on Twitter. You see the threads there, but he takes it to a new level in the newsletter. So why don't you talk a little bit about that, Jacob?
Yeah, so every Friday we do In the Lab, which is cool. It's a way for me to be interactive with the newsletter readers. They fill out a Google form and let me know which players they want to learn about. And I'll toot my horn for a second here. We've hit on some really important situations as the year develops. I love that it comes on Friday because it's like I've had the whole week to really digest everything that just happened and think about what's going on with these players and these teams and what to expect going forward. And so week 1, we hit on Marvin Harrison Jr. and the Cardinals and like how better days are probably ahead. We hit on Bucky Irving and how I really do think he's cutting into this workload and has potential to actually take over the backfield. And we see it seems like that's starting to happen. Also hit on Jameson Williams. That was a big one where people didn't know what to do with him. And it was just like I could clearly outline like how the role has changed. And so just like really contextualizing everything on some of the more hot topics each week and helping people feel more confident in how to handle those situations. Week 2 was another big one. And this was probably the biggest, is like people were panicking after week 2 about Derrick Henry. And I just simply pointed out the Ravens have been playing from behind in almost all, I think it was like 24% of their snaps they were playing with a lead. That makes a huge difference. And since then, we've seen them playing with a lead on almost every offensive snap, and Derrick Henry just going crazy. Another one was Jayden Daniels. People were panicking, obviously, about Terry McLaurin, but also about Jayden Daniels. People were like, should I move on from Jayden Daniels? And it's like, what are we talking about? And so it just helped kind of calm people down on that. Since then, Terry McLaurin has had 2 really good games. Chris Olave, Drake London were 2 people that were fantasy managers were panicking about, hit on them as well. And just like all the underlying stuff that's going on with the role and how over a larger sample size, it's probably going to balance out. Last week, took a deep dive on Caleb Williams and how much Shane Waldering is affecting things there. I think that's going to be one that we're going to have to be closely monitoring every week and seeing how things evolve. Because if they don't evolve, then like I said, in that outlook in going into week 4 is like, he's basically driving a car without second and third gear. He's got, if you've ever driven a stick, you get this analogy. He's got first gear and he's trying to go all the way to 4th and 5th gear all the time. And it's a mess. Like he's taking sacks all the time. People are like, why doesn't he get the ball out? Why is he trying to play hero ball? Because that's what the route concepts are calling for. There's something simple that doesn't happen. And then after that, there's no other option. It's been really frustrating. And I don't even know if they're going to be able to take advantage of this string of beautiful matchups that they have coming up. Right. I mean, last week, it was abysmal in the passing game in a really, really soft spot. Week before, that was kind of the same way. He piled up garbage time points, but he was going against one of the best matchups possible against the Colts and just wasn't able to do much. And so just detailing all of this for you to help you feel like you have a better understanding and higher confidence level. It looks like I took an early look at the players that people want to hear about. It looks like Devon Achane, Xavier Worthy, Travis Kelce, and probably Justin Fields are the players that I'll write about this Friday. So be on the lookout for that. And definitely subscribe to the FFT newsletter if you haven't. It's free.
Yeah, and we're not here to toot our own horn. Like, there's going to be wins, there's going to be losses within this, but the data is there and the process is there. And Jacob's process on these newsletters is unbelievable. You know it if you read it, but if you're not, sign up. It's free. But let's close out. We're already over time. Jacob. I want to close out with 2 players, though. I need to close out with 2 players here. The first is a player who I think has the potential to be the best guy to trade for before this week, in the sense that you can trade for him and he could potentially be a wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 range down the stretch, not viewed as that by everyone right now, and the guy that can potentially win your league. And that's Brian Thomas Jr., the rookie out of Jacksonville. So talk a little bit about him, and I'll talk a little bit about what I saw when I went back and watched all the snaps on tape last night.
All I'll say here is that this week 5 matchup is perfect. And so this feels like the opportunity where everybody's getting hyped on him, but he might come out and have 170 yards in this game or something. Like, I do think this is like the jumping off point where if you want to buy on BTJ, it's probably now. So it's that Colts defense that I just mentioned, Gus Bradley. It's the most predictable defense in the NFL. They use cover 3 more than any defense. And Brian Thomas Jr. eats against cover 3. Perimeter receivers eat against cover 3. Typically the top receiver. That's what we saw last year with Calvin Ridley. And BTJ has only expanded upon that. Also, Trevor Lawrence has been at his best against cover 3. He's actually been very accurate in terms of delivering a highly accurate ball. And his off-target rate is about league average against cover 3, which is significantly better than against all the other coverages where he's like basically the worst. If ever there's an opportunity for BTJ to consistently get open and also have the ball delivered to him consistently, I know you don't want to bet on Trevor Lawrence at this point. I feel that, but like this is the spot to do it. So yeah, everything underlying data on BTJ is really, really impressive. He kind of seems like he's in the mold of a Nico Collins kind of guy where he's working down the field consistently, but he's also drawing targets on 20+% of his routes. I don't know how long that will stick, but I think it's possible that it does. I said I was only going to talk about the matchup, but here we are. When I dug into BTJ's collegiate profile, I was concerned about his target rates at first, but then I found that with Malik Neighbors off the field, his target rates were actually pretty respectable. And we did have one game where Neighbors left early and he was an alpha. He had like 13 targets and the offense was flowing through him. And so to me, that shows that he has the ability to do more than just this simple downfield stuff that they were asking him to do at LSU. He can potentially be like a consistent winner that an offense runs through. And he did that as a 20-year-old. So yeah, I'm super, super excited. The sky's the limit.
Yeah, I'll just keep it brief as well. I watched every snap of his on tape last night to prepare for the show. I think his tape so far in the NFL is even more impressive than his tape at LSU. I had him as wide receiver 5 behind A.D. Mitchell on my evaluation going into the season, just based on tape in college. His tape has been even better than A.D. Mitchell's, who's been actually really impressive as well, because he's winning in ways that I did not for sure expect him to win. Down the field with double moves, the ability to sink his hips and get in and out of his breaks looks unbelievably fluid and impressive. He's playing super fast for a rookie. I was a little concerned with how limited his route tree was at LSU, if that would be a problem for him. It's not at all. He's starting to get utilized a little bit in the red zone where he will be a weapon, and that's where he is a one-on-one matchup winner. I actually think this is the guy to go trade for. That's not like the super buy low. But we don't have that much time. I want to get into one more guy to close out with, the guy I think you should add to all of your rosters because he is available in a lot of leagues right now. And it's Trey Tucker, the wide receiver from the Raiders. Jacob, give us any thoughts you have on Trey Tucker heading into this week with Devontae Adams already ruled out, will not play this week, and will likely be traded before next week.
This is our Tutu Atwell call of the week. Trey Tucker is a dog. He's not just a fast guy. He can win over the middle and intermediate. And I think he's somebody who might be able to get consistent targets. I think he can win a little bit different way than Jacoby Myers, who will probably kind of fill that Devontae Adams role, working down the field a little bit more. And so it'll be like Tucker and Brock Bowers doing the shorter stuff. He's going to be probably inconsistent because this is one of the worst passing games in the NFL. So I don't want to, freak out about it, but I'm pretty excited for him.
I feel the same way. Obviously, we're not going crazy. It's not one of the passing games we can trust, but his speed adds a different dimension to the offense. You can see it on tape. I almost think about it like his ability to separate. It's a combo of this. It's like, yes, he has the raw speed, but it's also game speed that you can obviously see on tape, and it's going to change how the Raiders can run their offense with him getting more snaps. I think they're going to use him also around the line of scrimmage. I think I'm going to use him in motion and with some like end arounds, things like that. So I think there's an opportunity for him to maybe develop into the role that we're seeing Rashid Shaheed develop into with the Saints, which would be really good for fantasy because Shaheed, we don't have to get into that now. We don't have time for it, but the numbers from Shaheed from last week are super impressive. And you can find a deeper dive into that from Jacob on this week's newsletter if you want more information and data on that. But I am excited about Tucker being just that guy I want at the back end of my bench. He's available still in so many leagues, and he's so much more valuable to me than a lot of the players that will be be on the bench. But look, we've gone overboard today, Jacob. We're running out of time. So on that note, I am going to close out here. Thank you to everybody who's tuned into this podcast. I really appreciate it. Hopefully nobody's tuned out by now. Please help us grow by hitting the like and subscribe button. You can find our content on Beyond the Box Scores Mondays and Thursdays. Have a great rest of your weekend. Good luck in your matchups, and we'll talk to you soon.